With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Ukraine has been rocked by a political earthquake. The sudden ouster of Andrey Yermak, President Volodymyr Zelensky's all-powerful chief of staff, has cracked open Kyiv's wartime leadership and ignited a fierce contest over how the country should now be governed. Yermak, long known as the Green Cardinal, evolved from an obscure lawyer and B-movie producer into Zelensky's most influential advisor, a figure many insiders quietly described as a co-president. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed a full shake-up of his presidential office, announcing the resignation of powerful Chief of Staff Andrey Yermak amid the corruption furor.
The office of the President of Ukraine will be rebooted. The head of the office, Andrey Yermak, resigned. I am grateful to Andrey for always representing the Ukrainian position in the negotiations exactly as it should be. It has always been a patriotic position. But I want there to be no rumors and speculation. As for the new head of the office, tomorrow I will hold consultations with those who can lead this institution. We will have negotiations soon. Our representatives will be there. It will include the Chief of the General Staff, representatives of the Foreign Ministry, the NSDC Secretary, and our intelligence. And when we all have such an external challenge of war, we have to be strong inside.
His firing over a $100 million corruption scandal has emboldened opposition forces who are renewing demands for a national unity government, a call they've pushed since Russia's full-scale invasion nearly 4 years ago. The timing is explosive. Zelensky now loses his closest strategist just as he heads into fraught negotiations with Washington over Donald Trump's divisive peace plan, while Russian forces intensify winter operations in the Donbass. According to Politico, despite Yermak's power, many in Kiev and Western capitals won't mourn his departure. Critics say his influence stifled institutions, pointing to last summer's aborted attempt to curb Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies. One former senior official said they never believed he would go, while lawmaker Lesia Vasilenko called the exit proof of zero tolerance for corruption. Others describe it as a long overdue breath of fresh air. But skepticism remains. Former Deputy Prime Minister Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze told Politico that real change will require a return to constitutional governance and a unity cabinet accountable to Parliament, not the presidential office. And there's a final warning from journalist and ex-Zelensky advisor Yulia Mendel. Yermak's resignation may be a desperate reaction to unbearable pressure, but he may still remain a shadow puppeteer behind the scenes.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to It's a Monday, and welcome to the week. Nice to have your company. Hope you had a great weekend. I did. I mowed the lawn. Party animal number one. Today's topic on the protagonist is it's called Ukraine corruption, the flying monkeys. Now there are flying monkeys all around Zelensky at the moment. The phrase flying monkeys is used to describe people who perform the bidding of a narcissist or abuser. Flying monkeys can act as spies, spread rumours, and even act as substitutes for abusers. They're often codependent and have been drawn into the narcissist's false narrative. In considering Zelensky and his enablers, foreign and domestic, it's hard to distinguish the abuser from the abused, is it? Which is which, or are they all doing it to themselves too? Spank me. Zelensky's top aide, Andrey Yermak, has resigned amid a corruption probe. Now, Yermak has alleged links to a recently uncovered money laundering operation. The raid by Ukraine anti-corruption agencies is linked to a $100 million graft scheme carried out by a crime ring tied to Zelensky's inner circle and led by a guy called Timur Mindich, a close business associate of Zelensky. It's alleged that Western funds provided to support power-producing facilities were embezzled. Now, Mindich has left the country. Europe, Zelensky's most ardent backer, remains silent. Only Hungary and Slovakia have voiced outrage. There are no calls for further investigation or international inquiry. Are they concerned that investigation will lead back to themselves? Economist Steve Henke estimates that of the $360 billion sent to Ukraine, 50 to 30% has been lost to corruption. And while European leaders pledge ongoing support for the war, their citizens are shortchanged. And governments in Australia and New Zealand, who should never have become involved in this proxy war, are poised to pour millions of dollars more into a special NATO program that buys American-made weapons for Ukraine. Big, beautiful weapons, as Donald Trump would say. Our guest today are Dr. Gordon Hahn, an expert Russian analyst and author, Robbie Barwick, director of the Australian Citizens Party, and Joachim Hagopian, who's an independent journalist and an old friend of the station, not so old, but he doesn't look too bad for his age at that. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. First of all, I need to ask you, Joachim, what's your overall overview? Hello, the overview of what's happening at the moment. Do you think, because they're talking about 100 million, and really, if you look at it, that's just touching the top of the whole bowl of worms and grubs, because there would have to be, out of the 360 billion, which is US, by the way, to think there's only $100 million has disappeared. It would have to be a lot more, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, it's only the tip of the iceberg. More to come. It's all going to get exposed eventually. But yeah, this is definitely the beginning of the end for Zelensky and his illegal regime. The guy was supposed to have a re-election way back in May of last year. And obviously he's overextended his stay now. And, Putin's not even willing to negotiate, talk to the guy, because he is not legit, rightfully so.
Gordon, what do you think? What's the just a quick overview of your thoughts of the unraveling of this, and do you think there will be an unraveling? I mean, or will it just be all swept away? Because 100 million out of 360 billion is just, it's nothing, is it?
Well, I think the main driver is the fact that the front and the army, the Ukrainian army itself, are collapsing. And so I've been writing for, I don't know, about a year now that there was going to be a sequence of collapses beginning with the front, then the army, and the next would be the regime. So we are now running into just beginning to enter a phase in which the regime might collapse. My suspicion is that this is being driven actually by the United States in order to pressure Zelensky to make compromises. And it appears from the meeting yesterday, according to what what's been reported anyway, is that they didn't come into any new agreement, that the Ukrainians didn't make any concessions on the main issues that would have to be conceded to some extent in order to get the Russians to sign on. And the reason I think that these two things are connected, along with the collapsing front, is that the case emerged. There was a report in the newspaper Ukrainskaya Pravda that they had gotten information about that this Timur Mindich was being investigated many months ago, and yet they never reported on it. And suddenly, the Mindich Gate scandal breaks just as the 28-point plan appears, and there's negotiations over that and about trying to resolve the war. And then you have last week statements by various Ukrainian leaders that they're not going to make any compromises. Yermak makes a statement that a similar statement. Zelensky, and the next morning, Nabu raids Yermak's offices. So that leads me to believe that this is being used to put pressure on Zelensky to make compromises in negotiations, and it appears that that's not working. So the next question becomes, what do they do if Zelensky doesn't bend? Are they going to try to break him and have him removed from power? It's also interesting that General Zelensky, who was the former commander of the army and is now the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to London, has published 2 articles in the space of less than a week, I think. So he's reappeared. And of course, then the other question is, will anybody who replaces Zelensky be necessarily more willing to negotiate with the Russians? So that's another problem, is that the Washington would have to find a more pliable leader, and it's not clear whether they could find one who would be viable.
Robbie Barwick, what's your thoughts?
Largely what Gordon said. You know that this corruption is rife in Ukraine ever since the conflict's been on. The mail that I've had out of Washington is that the level of corruption has been a hidden scandal that's actually concerned Washington a lot, because what happens if it comes out? There was at least 1, maybe 2 visits by the head of the CIA under Biden to Kiev to try and deal with this behind the scenes. So it's not a new problem. It's a entrenched problem, and therefore the fact that it's coming out now at this time makes you suspicious that there's an ulterior motive for it, which presumably is what Gordon has said. The Washington's trying to use it as pressure on Zelensky. What I'm interested in finding out is what are the European backers doing here, especially the British. The British are the ones who most forcefully helped get Ukraine into this mess. It was Boris Johnson that persuaded Zelensky not to take that deal in 2022. And when it comes to corruption, the British control essentially the world's offshore network for tax evasion and money laundering, for all the offshore tax havens they control, all centred in that all feed back to the City of London. So there'd be a lot of British involvement in helping, launder the proceeds of this corruption. So what's their reaction to these revelations, and what are they doing behind the scenes to counteract Washington pressure, if that's what it is?
I just got to ask Gordon, because you're an expert on all this sort of stuff. Washington are threatening for a full-blown audit. Probably the last thing that Zelensky would want, but if they have that full-blown audit on where the money's gone, Which way do you think Donald Trump will swing? Because one minute he loves Zelensky, hand on shoulder. Next minute he doesn't love Zelensky, not hand on shoulder. If they have a full-blown audit, they're going to find all sorts of ugly things. What do you think they'll find?
They're going to find massive, corruption in Ukraine existed even before the war. In fact, it existed immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and to some extent even during the perestroika era. As the party state began to dissolve and people began to steal the state, as one interesting book on the subject revealed. So it's hard to tell. I mean, Trump's going to is in a position where now he has to make a decision. How far does he want to go in pushing Zelensky? They've already, we've already seen numerous cases, and some of the information that's come out since this scandal broke has indicated that there was not only corruption dealing with rebuilding the electricity network, stealing funds intended to go to that, but there was illegal activity by Rustam Umerov, who was the defense minister at the time and now is the secretary of the Defense and Security Council, and who replaced Yermak as the chief negotiator in the talks with the United States yesterday. That he was involved in a corruption scheme in buying bulletproof vests at extraordinary prices and skimming off the top. Again, corruption in Ukraine is endemic. It is the system. Okay, the parliament is completely bought and sold. Zelensky ran roughshod over the Constitutional Court when they tried to move on cases tied to certain powers that would make it less likely for Zelensky to be able to escape investigation. Remember, in July, Zelensky tried to shut down the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, NABU, and not shut them down, but to take them under control of the presidency. And actually, it'd be worthwhile discussing, how NABU, to whom NABU is subordinated and how it's created, because it's really it underscores Ukraine's lack of sovereignty. Because NABU's director and members of its board are selected by a commission, and 3 of the commission members are members of the Ukrainian government, and 3 are representatives of international non-governmental organizations like the Soros Open Society Foundation and the sort. And so, for many years, NABU has been considered to be sort of run out of basically the State Department, which is closely connected to Soros in many ways, and USAID and so forth. And the FBI has an office in the same building that NABU has its offices in, and there's a representative of the FBI who works in the NABU office, and they go over cases together. And so, to the extent that this case involves, American budget funds for assistance to Ukraine, it's obvious that the FBI would have been working on the case. So it's logical to assume, right, that the FBI is actually driving this case on the direction from Trump to put some pressure on Zelensky. And again, like as I started to talk about, Trump basically has to make a decision. How far does he want to push this? Does he want to push Zelensky so far that he begins to weaken the regime in general, which is already beginning to happen, to the extent that Yermak is gone, and Yermak constructed the so-called executive vertical, as they call it in Russia and Ukraine, of power, the executive vertical of power. And would he go so far as to actually seek Zelensky's removal, and how would that happen? Would that happen some way through impeachment, forcing elections on Zelensky, or by some kind of a coup? So it's hard to tell. Another option would be for the British to activate some of the neo-Nazis And of course, some of these things can happen on their own, even without Western nudging, as the front collapses, because people are looking for someone to blame. And logically, it's Zelensky. The other thing to remember is Zelensky, has been. Everybody understands in Ukraine that Zelensky is corrupt. This is an open secret, right? His first mentor was Ihor Kolomoisky, who was a criminalized oligarch who, at some point, was banned from entering the United States until some point in the Biden administration, when they let him back in. Then he returned. He was arrested by Zelensky. For reasons that remain somewhat unclear. And this guy Mindich, around whom this new case involves, basically was becoming the new Kolomoisky, or you might call him, if you want to make a Russian comparison, Berezovsky, a Ukrainian Berezovsky, like Kolomoisky was. So he's surrounded by corruption. All these people who have been arrested in this case were friends of Mindich, the lead figure in this case. He routinely spent time with Mindich on the weekends. He had a birthday party with Mindich. So they're very close friends, and they were also co-owners of the Quartal 95 television production company that worked at the TV station that Kolomoisky owned. So they're all in bed together. So there's no way that Zelensky didn't know that this stuff was going on, and he's doing his best to cover it up.
Robbie Barwick, from just looking at Australia, because we've just, it's been in the news a bit that we're going to send another bunch of millions upon millions upon millions to, and same thing with New Zealand, to NATO, so they can purchase some big, beautiful American missiles and whatever. And you just heard from Gordon there, we know that Zelensky is a crook. The whole lot of it, they're all corrupt. And that's how Ukraine operates. Hasn't changed, it never will change. And if we know this and that the world knows it, why would our government here in Australia and New Zealand, why would they decide to and make it public that we're going to send more money to Ukraine or to NATO? Why would that happen?
Well, appearances can be deceiving, Mike. It might look like I'm sitting up, but I'm actually on the floor. And I've been on the floor for months, ever since I learned that the Europeans called their little rearguard defense action to try and save the Ukraine war and keep it going, the coalition of the willing. And I thought, how could they recycle that term from the Iraq war, right? The most discredited, military action ever, the coalition of the willing. Not only did they call it that, but Australia joined it. So we are part of, Keir Starmer's bloody coalition of the willing. And when I heard that, I'm just flabbergasted that could happen. But everything about this war and Australia's role in it has been completely bizarre. I personally spent a lot of 2024 trying to draw attention to the fact that the leading Banderite in the world, an overt Banderite Nazi, was an Australian, Stefan Romanev. And then he up and died on me. He died suddenly of a heart attack. And then our government gave him a state funeral. They gave an overt Banderite Nazi a state funeral here in Australia. And Jewish politicians attended this state funeral. And I was trying to get some kind of media coverage just for what I considered should have been the scandal of the year. And I could get nothing because, and it just illustrates that when it comes to this conflict, our position as Australia's position is one completely hypocritical, completely subservient to the US NATO apparatus. And I have lots of other criticisms of how Australia has subjugated its sovereignty to this apparatus. But then on top of that, I mean, we could just give moral support. There's nothing, that's at least that's cheaper. We've given already over $1 billion Australian dollars of material support for this conflict, for Ukraine in this conflict, and now we're going to give more. And the Latika Burke, when she reported this, she's one of our more prominent mainstream media journalists, sort of on the tabloid end of the scale. When she broke this news the other night, I think her publication is now called The Nightly. She tweeted about it, and she said, "Good news. Australia is going to be giving this extra money. With Australia and New Zealand, the only non-NATO members to be, it's like as if we're being allowed to give this extra money. And I replied to her tweet saying, I get that this is newsworthy, but why, you're an objective journalist. Why is this good news? Right. But that was her just letting the mask slip. The whole of the Australian establishment, the two major political parties, the military-industrial complex here, which is just the whatever the Americans let us have, and the media, which is again one of the most tightly concentrated in the world in terms of Murdoch and a couple of other billionaires and the state media, they are all completely and heavily invested in this conflict, and so they just think they can spin it, and anything to do with it, they pretend it's some kind of good news. And it's very blatant, it's very open, but that's the state of play in Australia.
Yeah, I've got to ask Joachim here, because you're a fan of Trump, and you'll be impressed with him. You'll be impressed with the Don, threatening to have an audit. Tell me, in your humble opinion, if that happened, and that's highly doubtful, because the things they'll find there could incriminate everybody. We know that the war was just a complete. This is just a complete scam, and it's a farce. We know who the baddies are and the goodies are. And the baddies are probably right through and through a NATO and all the NATO members. And we even see that Sweden has taken delivery, or about to take delivery, of some missiles so that they can shoot at Russia, which is not really a wise thing to do, because the Helgas there will be, they'll have to go out and fight and not make love, but it's got to fight a war. But I'm just thinking, though, if they do have that audit and they do have a thorough investigation, in your humble opinion and observance, what do you think they'll find?
What do I think of what?
What do you think they'll find with their investigation?
Well, here's my take.
Mm-hmm.
Trump knows he has no bargaining chips on how this war ends. He made the promise that's not been fulfilled, that he would end the war within 24 hours of his second term on office. That failed. He's getting desperate. And yeah, he's connected to that FBI that shares the same office building as NABU, the corruption agency in Ukraine. And he realizes that Europe, EU, NATO are all for the forever war in Ukraine to try and weaken Russia. They're all talking about going to war against Russia all the time. And Trump realizes that the only way to break this deadlock is to get rid of Zelensky, because after all, Putin won't even talk to him. So we got to get rid of Zelensky and bring in the British ambassador from Ukraine. I think that's what's in store. I think they're going to remove Zelensky and they're going to bring in the general, and he's going to kind of oversee the surrender of Ukraine to Russia. Or if it doesn't go that way, we know the outcome will be military. It will be resolved eventually by the Russian military that are making so much advances and strides. And I think they got 8 axes along the line of engagement that they're just completely crushing now, from west to east all the way. So it's not much longer militarily. So if this doesn't give and Zelensky's out and they bring in somebody that's pliable, that can be used as the quote leader of Ukraine and be neutral, all those conditions that Russia from the very get-go has been demanding, then they're going to make the military. But I think this is Trump's kind of last straw as an effort to be a big peacemaking honcho, like he loves to do, saying, oh yeah, I settled 8 wars in 2 weeks, yeah, bullshitter. But anyway, yeah, this is a last desperado move by Trump to maybe end the war and get credit for ending the war.
Gord, what will, if they move ahead with this and they have the audit, and then we have a sort of a ceasefire or peace, In your humble opinion, what will happen to Zelensky?
Well, if there's a if there's a peace agreement, uh, even if he somehow leads the process, which is highly unlikely, and he certainly can't sign an agreement. Putin's underscored that several times because he's not technically, juridicially, the leader of the president of Ukraine. He said he's willing to negotiate with him. If there's a peace agreement, so it depends on the nature of the peace agreement. I mean, it's hard to tell if we don't have a peace agreement. In terms of maybe I go back to what Joachim was saying. One problem with bringing in General Zelensky, several problems. One is that he just wrote an article in which he said Ukraine will never surrender, and the ultimate goal of Ukraine should be to break up, basically invade Russia and break Russia up into pieces. So at this point, he's not someone who would be willing to move the peace process forward unless this article is a cover for something else. Now, he may change over time once the front goes into absolutely full collapse, which it should do within the next half year or so, and the Russian troops are at the stage or at the one step before the stage of being able to move on Kiev. That will concentrate some minds in Kiev, and presumably if Zelensky were president or caretaker leader of some sort, he might be more willing to make compromises. But right now, he's not the kind of person who looks willing to make compromise. And the other issue we have to look at is looking at Europe, which is playing a role very similar to the role that Australia is playing. They basically need to keep this war. Basically, the war is a war for the right to continue to expand NATO. That was the whole purpose of getting Zelensky to renege on his initialing of the peace agreement back in April 2022. Without a defeat of Russia, NATO risks not being able to continue to expand all along Russia's western flank. So that's what the war is about, and Europe is fully on board. So the problem is that Europe now, like the Ukrainians, they've been arguing that Moscow wants to conquer Europe, wants to conquer all of Ukraine, so forth and so on, that Putin is basically the Hitler of the 21st century. They're having a hard time. They're going to have a hard time climbing down from that. It's going to be hard to convince the German people, the French people, the Italian people, the British people that yes, we need to sign a peace treaty with Putin if Putin is the Hitler of today and Russia was supposed to conquer all of Europe. The obvious question would be, why is this not another Munich? That's what some people will be asking. And what about everything you said prior to this? Why are we now dealing with this guy who is the devil? So they can't climb down. They've created a alternative reality that too many people have bought into, including themselves. They've brainwashed themselves. And politically now they can't climb down. There's no way out. They have to keep going forward. The other issue is that they're against Trump, not just because of his position on the war. They're against Trump for many reasons. So one way to weaken Trump is to lead to his failure to conclude a peace treaty. Because when election time comes around and either J.D. Vance or some other successor comes in, who might be Republican, who might be willing to defend, a Republican candidate who might be willing to defend Trump's position, the issue will be, well, he promised to solve the war in one day and he never was able to solve it. So they're trying to set up 3 years down the road for a different type of president to come into the Oval Office who will be willing to restore all the former assistance to Ukraine. And they're trying to drag this out for another 2 or 3 years. So, it's a multi-layered chess game with lots of moving parts. And to try to guess what's going to happen after a peace treaty is signed is very difficult. One thing I'm worried about is that the regime may collapse and the state even may begin to collapse before there's a peace treaty. Because this peace effort could, in theory, drag out till, who knows, next summer. And by next summer, the whole thing's going to be coming down in Ukraine. I mean, that's going to be the end of Ukraine. The front's going to collapse. The army's going to be collapsed. Uh, the regime's going to be in more desperate state, and people will be pointing fingers at each other. So what we're seeing now with this Nabu case is going to be a picnic compared to what we're going to see when the crunch comes around Kiev in this war. So it's a very dangerous, complex situation, very difficult to predict.
Gordon, I'm just thinking though, if what you're saying does happen, that you don't have to worry about Russia could in fact just sit outside and watch it all fall apart. How would the scenery look then? If it all collapses before there's a peace treaty or a ceasefire or something like that, and it all implodes, that you have all these people running around without heads, and which could very well happen, but they won't be running around, quite immobile. In fact, Russia could just sit out and watch it all happen. But how would it look? I mean, what would the whole of Ukraine look, and what would NATO do about it? Because here's something that they created, and then we have this whole thing falling apart. Do they get involved in trying to quell the uprising within the uprising?
That's the problem. I mean, the logical thing would be that the front would sort of natural border for a front and for stabilization and for dividing Ukraine up by different parties would be for Russia to take everything east of the Dnieper. I'm assuming here that there's a regime and even state collapse. Maybe even Ukrainian warlords are fighting amongst themselves. Russia would move in and be able to take everything up to the Dnieper over the course of a year and a half maximum. And in the West, one can imagine that the Russians would say, okay, you want to move into Western Russia. Putin has already suggested at times that, Hungary and Romania might be willing to take parts of far Western Ukraine that have Romanian speaking and Hungarian speaking populations, and they have been under some pressure from the Kiev regime. Their languages have been language schools have been closed down, and there's a really brutal mobilization of people in this part of in these regions of Ukraine. And then the other option the more dangerous option, obviously, is if the French do what they're talking about, moving troops, say, into Odessa, and other NATO countries, not necessarily under the NATO flag, decide to move troops into Western Ukraine to make sure the Russians don't cross the Dnieper. And so assuming that they can somehow stabilize Western Ukraine, well, then you might have a standoff, and you might not have a NATO-Russia military conflict, but you might have one. So again, it's a very extremely dangerous situation, because both sides are going to be dealing potentially with societies in chaos, possibly having to feed people, not enough clean water. If this happens in a cold winter, it can be a real mess.
Yeah,
it already is a mess.
Yeah, well, what's the saying? It's be careful of what you sow. Robbie, if what Gordon says happens, and we have this utter chaos, and not counting on France moving in, because I see Macron says there are many who want to go into Ukraine and save democracy or something like that, which is just all BS, by the way. But what does Australia and New Zealand do? Do we send in our troops to maintain this status quo, that is corruption, or do we send in our troops to try and bring law and order? Or don't we send any troops at all? Because if you look at our last, except for the money we gave those Bushmasters, I don't think it was well received, because they kept breaking down. They were very much like a Hillman Imp car. I mean, they're reliable. I mean, it's great down hills, but any other direction, not very good at all. What do we do? Do we then get? And I can see Albanese, because he's our Prime Minister, by the way, Gordon, or an imitator of a Prime Minister. But he'll be really keen to send some troops there, just to show you that not only can we save the world from climate change, we can also save the world from World War III.
Well, I do believe that when there was a discussion a little while ago about would there be some kind of a peacekeeping operation under some kind of Ukraine settlement, Albanese did not rule out Australian soldiers being part of a peacekeeping operation, which in its own way is a bit controversial because it's given his background as a supposedly a politician with a left-leaning background, etc. His whole career he had a position tending to be against wars. He was a critic of the Iraq War. He's supposedly pro-Palestinian, etc. His compliance with this NATO agenda has been something to see. So yeah, he didn't rule out that we would have some kind of a peacekeeping presence or be part of that. But this has come up in Australia before. In 2015, you might remember, Mike, or 2014, when after MH17 was shot down, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, there were Australians on board that. Our Prime Minister then, Tony Abbott, famously said that he was going to shirt front Vladimir Putin at the next big international, I don't think it was APEC, it was something else, G20, I think. We had the G20 in Australia, and Vladimir Putin came to Australia, hugged a koala, and Abbott had warned he would shirt front him. But it turned out later that Abbott had actually sounded out the military here, the Australian Defence Force, about having Australia having a military response to the downing of MH17, i.e., us sending our armed forces over there to Ukraine. So this issue seems to touch a capacity in Australian politicians where they suddenly have delusions of grandeur, right? Because we don't even have a military. We can't even recruit for our own military here, Mike. We have just bribed the country of Papua New Guinea with a sporting team. We're paying $500 million for them to have a rugby league team in our competition, so they would agree to a deal with us by which we can now recruit people from Papua New Guinea to be part of the Australian Armed Forces, because we can't recruit enough of our own. So these really are delusions of grandeur that we have. And I just want to make one last comment just in response to what's already been said. Isn't there a contradiction here, though, with Trump? Because on the one hand, there does seem to be a side of Trump where he wants to bring this conflict to an end for all the reasons, including the ego ones that have been identified. And he's up against that whole American establishment military-industrial complex that wanted this war, and the European one. They definitely don't want to end the war, right? And so he's up against that, and so he does seem to be a lone operator in that regard. He has a Secretary of State who's a snake, who has to put on one face to be seen to be representing Trump, but clearly Trump doesn't even trust him, so he barely uses him. But nevertheless, Rubio has to play a certain role, and he wants to keep the war going too. But so that seems to be some intention of Trump's on one side, but then instead of going through this charade of a corruption scandal and whatever, he has the ultimate ace, doesn't he? Just stop funding the thing. I mean, this is what we expected when he got elected, not this whole thing. If he actually just absolutely cut Ukraine off, doesn't that end this? Because that's what he hasn't done yet.
Joachim, doesn't it end this?
Yeah, we've been waiting for him to cut off funds and weapons to Ukraine, and it hasn't happened. I think it's going to happen because that's the only way, basically, that the war, I believe, will end. I really don't see a diplomatic solution. I don't think that Zelensky or Europe will allow that to happen. So, yeah, I maintain that the EU and NATO also are desperate to hold on and exist, because I believe that Europe, along with North America and a lot of the world, is going to really go into an economic crisis very soon. And populism will take over the politics. And I don't believe that these idiots in Europe, nor the idiot in Washington, D.C., is even going to be retaining their power. I believe that basically it is going to end probably with Russian military victory. And, the rest of the West, all of them, I see them as crumbling. I believe that Western civilization is in the process of the beginning stage of crumbling into a total collapse.
What,
Can I
Russia?
jump in here on that
Yes,
question?
please do. Please do. Yes.
I think a big issue here is Trump. He's always markets himself as a winner, and if he cuts off all the funding, Intel military assistance basically has stopped, but Intel and any financial assistance that remains, if he does that, and the whole front crumbles and the Russians march to the Dnieper, then everybody's going to say he lost the war. Doesn't matter how untrue that may or may not be. That's what the Democratic Party is going to say, and that's even many of the people in the Republican Party are going to be saying if they're trying to oppose a successor candidate who's Trumpian in any way. So he needs to avoid that, and at least I think this is what's going on here. Is he may do that in the end if he has to, but he probably doesn't want to do that, and that's why he's pushing for a peace treaty, because we can get a peace treaty, then he can come out as the guy who made peace, the great peacemaker. Ukraine didn't actually lose the war, or at least it can be argued they didn't lose the war, that he actually saved Ukraine. But if the whole thing collapses on his watch, it's going to be very difficult for him and any successor that the kind that he would prefer um, to win an election. So I think that's really what's driving this. But if the peace agreement fails and the pressure on Zelensky it doesn't work, and there's no way to get rid of him through an impeachment or elections or a coup. He may just do that and throw the dice and say, okay, we're cutting everything off and let's see what happens. Let's see how the Europeans react and how fast it crumbles.
Yeah, it's really it's a challenge to determine who's more corrupt at the moment. It's at the moment if you said put your hand up if you're the most corrupt, we probably have everybody putting their hand up, which doesn't help the situation. Before Robert said that Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, was quite interested in sending a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. Gordon, two things there. One, they have to be invited, first of all. And if you look at the French, Macron is not at all thinking about that he will be invited. He's just going to do that. If he does that, and if, say, for example, sends troops over there uninvited, isn't that in fact declaring war on Russia?
Absolutely, and the Russians have already said that they will be legal targets if they do. So send 2,000 troops to Odessa, and in a year they'll all be dead, if not sooner. So, and of course, in the process, we'll probably have started World War III. So what is the point? One wonders, where these people, what world are they operating in? At the same time, the Europeans, they talk all this big talk, but they don't have weapons building capacity. They don't have sufficient armies to take on the Russians. The Russians now are battle hardened. They are now the leaders in conducting, drone-based warfare or drone-led warfare, along with the Ukrainians. So it's really just pie in the sky, and you wonder what these people are thinking.
Well, they're not thinking at all, are they, Robbie? And if you look at Anthony Albanese, Tony Abbott, when he was considering, as you mentioned before, sending some military presence there, would they go dressed up as a prime minister, and he wears these budgie smugglers, these speedos, and that alone may win the war, because once someone looked at him in those bathers swimming attire, you would head for the hills very quickly. But I'm just thinking though. What is Australia and what is Albanese? Why are we still going down this path? Do we not understand that what we're doing is poking the bear in the nose? The bear is actually a pretty good bear at this stage. He's minding his own business. They had 175 missiles fired at Russia, and then Russia said, "Bugger off! We're not going to put up with that anymore." And then we had the escalation. this could be settled so easily, but we have politicians not only in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, we sent bushmasters to Ukraine to help them out, truly. I mean, well, you might as well send a bomb because they're terrible, terrible vehicles. So what we're doing is using them as a get rid of our old equipment. We'll write that off. Yes, it went to war, got blown up. No, it went to war. It didn't go to war once it got there because it couldn't start.
Yep. Yep.
But then we have all the European nations and countries, such as Sweden, who are purchasing a whole bunch of missiles from the US, big beautiful missiles, by the way. And Mats Nielsen has suggested that they're primed to shoot into Russia. I mean, what is it with the politicians these days? They must know, surely they must know, that if there is a all-out war, this could be settled in about 15 minutes. Unfortunately, you and I won't be talking about that ever again.
What really alarms me about politicians in countries like Australia and America, definitely, and probably in Europe as well, is there's a lot of effort put into patriotic messaging to try and gee up patriotism in the population and in the military, and that with that comes the mythology of our historical escapades as militaries, and there's always a certain amount of mythology there. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not ruling out the battles of the past where great deeds were done and real bravery was shown, but they spend so much time on that, people start to become deluded as if that's the permanent state of affairs, and it absolutely is not. And so you got politicians who just think that we're somehow, us in our alliance is somehow invincible, right? You got some other politicians who take it even further. It's not so much an issue in Australia, though it was a little bit under Scott Morrison. It's definitely an issue in the United States, where on top of that, they believe God is on their side. And so that I always worry that tends to make people really reckless and be prepared to try things and roll the dice in a way they shouldn't if they were actually rational people and were looking at the same landscape of war that we've been discussing here. And in the case of Australia, I literally just interrupted something I was writing to join this conversation. And I was writing it about Malcolm Fraser, the late former Prime Minister of this country, who I had the honour of getting to know in his final years. And getting to know Malcolm Fraser, and there's a very vocal, another Australian politician, former Prime Minister Paul Keating, and their generation of Australian politics, they were really, Malcolm Fraser's died now, but he was incredibly critical of NATO. He thought NATO should have been disbanded at the end of the Cold War. Paul Keating is of like mind. You can see Paul Keating back in the 90s warning against the expansion of NATO. But somewhere between that generation and now, there was a real takeover of the political minds of the major parties in our country to make them completely subservient to this NATO agenda, even now to the idea of expanding NATO into Asia. Not literally, and they call it that, but it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization will have some kind of a foothold here in Asia. And of course, that's about expanding this targeting of Russia to include China as well. Absolute insanity. And if it ever came to a conflict, well, we can see what's happening between Russia and Ukraine and that conflict. But I'll tell you what, if we ever pick the fight with China that some people want, blink and we'll miss it, and it'll be over for us, right? We are just being completely insane there. But our politicians seem to have bought into all this, and there's been a shift. There's been some kind of a takeover, and I think it's a foreign influence takeover of our country that has provoked them to be like this.
I find it really interesting too, Joachim, you're ex-military, you understand that you need firepower. The Chinese Navy, just a few months ago, they had an exercise somewhere off the coast of Australia, and our defence was magnificent. In fact, that we were alerted about 3 days into it by a commercial airlines pilot, I think it was Virgin Airlines, flying from Australia to New Zealand, and said, hello, there's a couple of boats down there that don't belong to Australia. So that's how good we are. And then we have our submarine fleet, which, I mean, if you ever look at something out of maybe Casey Jones, that steaming and rolling, that resembles something out of the First World War. And they're very noisy, and you can, puffs of smoke and all sorts of terrible things. So here we are. We're beating our chest. We have China on one hand, and they could do what they want to. But if you look at history, China hasn't started many wars for, I think, ever. If you look at the US's history, they can't help themselves. What happens then if, for example, if we do send our troops over and all sorts of things start going left field, what happens then? Does Russia say, hang on, guys, you got to just...
Yeah, I see it as the beginning of World War III. World War III will begin. Russia will not tolerate any kind of European troops on Ukraine domestic soil. They will not tolerate it. My view is that all we have as far as leaders in the world, we have puppets. We have puppets. They're not in control. They basically are dictated orders by City of London, Wall Street, the banking cabal. They are the crime syndicate of the world that operates this very lawless world we're living in right now. And the bottom line, they want depopulation. World War III will come in very handy to depopulate a good portion of our current near 8 billion population. And so I see this all as, they're bringing in AI robotics. They do not need humans. We're useless eaters to them. They want to get rid of us because they don't want an uprising, a global uprising against the tyranny that with the techno world we're living in, there's going to be neo-feudalism, enslavement. That's what's ahead if the controllers that are pulling all the puppet strings have their way. And unless there's a massive population pushback for, some kind of freedom and the liberty of our Constitution and all the rest of the Western, quote, liberal democracies that they claim, unless there's some kind of pushback globally by the people, we have a very dim and doom and gloom future.
Fantastic. I've finally met someone more miserable than I am. But it's true. I always look at that train coming towards us. People say it's light at the end of the tunnel. And so far, no one has convinced me it's not a train coming towards us. Gordon, if we are looking at, first of all, you need the will of the people. And the will of the people, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, it's getting a bit weak. And to say the will of the people probably is an over-exaggeration of what is around at the moment. If we look at, we're trying to achieve peace before it goes pear-shaped. If we're looking at that, tell me, in your humble opinion, sir, how can we're going to have the corrupt investigating the corrupt, and the bad, or the ones that want war, trying to tell another entity who want war not to have war. Can you make any sense of this? Because I don't understand how. I mean, one minute we have President Peace, or Donald Trump. He was going to have peace in 24 hours or 36 hours, whatever it was. None there now. Then he says, I don't like Putin. Putin, killing everybody. And then now he likes Putin, sort of. Doesn't like Zelensky, loves Zelensky. Is part of our problem, because there is corruption on both sides. And we see that that NATO, they have this strong desire to become the world conquering coalition of stupid. And then you see Donald Trump, who would love to be, and one minute he's saying we need to split Ukraine up. But on the other hand, he often beats his chest about wanting to be king of the universe. And if he really wanted peace, he could because Commander-in-Chief has a fair amount of sway with NATO. I just see all this is sort of like, well, I'll say my bit and you'll say your bit, and we'll have a bunch of words, but at the end of the day, nothing changes.
Well, I think he's trying to solve the problem. I think it's a genuine effort to attempt to make peace. The problem is The problem is that he's really, I think Robert was saying before that he's basically acting alone. I mean, look at his administration. He's surrounded by people like Rubio, a longtime neocon, and others. Tulsi Gabbard has suddenly become quiet. We don't know, we hear nothing from her about this key issue on Russia and Ukraine. So I think my fear is that this is sort of this is a great anomaly. The fact that we have Trump in the office, and for various reasons, he would prefer that this war ends, and that the United States have good relations with Russia. And I think that odds are that this is not going to last. And if he can't achieve a peace agreement by the time he leaves office, then I think we are looking to a great possibility of a larger European-wide war. Call it World War III, call it whatever you want. But I think this is absolutely true. I'm not a great fan of Donald Trump. I'm a conservative. Certainly not a. I certainly don't like the Democrats, but I don't like the Republicans either, and I don't particularly like Donald Trump's style. For my taste, he's not very presidential, but in this case, and he's done some other good things. I don't want to completely. He's clearly it was the better choice in the previous election, and he's done some good things in other areas, and he's surely useful in trying to put an end to this war. I think he's sincere about it. I think he wants to see people, the United States, doing business, and he understands that business that's clean and provides stability, not business that's corrupt and leads and risks us with nuclear war. But my fear again is that I think this is an anomaly. We got lucky because there were other reasons why he got elected. He really didn't get elected to put an end to the Ukrainian war. That was one issue, but it was not the top issue on the agenda of those people who voted for him. Those top issues were issues like immigration and political correctness and the DEI and so forth and so on, right? So, or the IED, whatever they call it, and. So I think those were the key issues. I don't think the war in Ukraine was central, but a good byproduct has been that he's been pushing for a peace agreement.
Almost time, gentlemen. I just want to ask each one of you same question. Robbie Barwick, where do you see the lay of the land in the next 12 months?
I find it very hard to predict these things. I genuinely hoped. I too thought out of Biden, Trump was the better choice, especially after that first debate. That was clearly the better choice. And my one hope was that he would act on this. I think I have issues with plenty of the other stuff he does, but if he could at least accomplish this of ending this war, that would be a great thing. And I thought he could have done it quite easily. Frankly, and the last 10 months has happened instead. So I actually find it very hard to predict. Zelensky is going to hang on for dear life because he's the kind, like, unless some country is already offering him safe harbor somewhere, if he's overthrown, he's dead. I mean, all those people that have been sacrificed on the front for nothing, there must be a lot of hatred for him. So he's going to be hanging on for dear life, and it's going to grind its way out in some way. Let's just hope it doesn't explode into something worse.
Joachim, just before I ask you the lay of the land, you just mentioned before you thought that, and you said that Russia was disassembling. Could you just explain that? Because I found that really interesting. Because normally someone doesn't say that Russia is crumbling from within. Just quickly, if you wouldn't mind explaining that, and also where you see the lay of the land with Ukraine, NATO, Europe, and the rest of the world in the next 12 months.
No, I did not say that Russia is crumbling. No way. Russia is the number one military power of the world right now. And then right behind them is China. No, I think the West is crumbling. The West is the weaker of the two. as far as what happens, I think that it's going to be a military victory for Russia. I don't think any kind of peace thing is going to happen because there's too many dissension voices that are against each other, and they do not want the war to end, and so it's going to end on Russia's terms. Um, and as far as the future, I think that Donald Trump is in deep trouble. He's going to have pedophilia. His little escapades with Jeffrey Epstein bring him down. It's ultimately going to cause him not to finish. They'll use health as the reason that he will depart as our 47th president. But I think he ran with Epstein for many years, and yes, he is a pedophile.
So just quickly, Joachim, who would replace Trump if, considering or assuming he has some time left to serve as president? Who would replace him? And that would be Vance, obviously. But who would replace him in the
Well, we got JD lined up. JD Vance, vice president.
But if there's there would have to be some sort of a backlash, of course, because of what you're saying. If that happened, and that also would also tarnish the entire Republican Party, in particular those that are in the inner circle, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, the Democrats are going to win both sides of Congress next year. There's no doubt. There's no doubt.
Gordon, that's terrifying, isn't it? If you
It's
think
going to be
about
a very dysfunctional U.S. government as usual.
Well,
It's just going to get worse, though.
I'll vote for Thomas Massey. I hope he takes over.
He's the man. Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I don't think he's got much of a chance. Just so if you wouldn't mind just commenting, by the way, Gordon, just to talk about JD Vance, if he did replace Donald Trump under circumstances that one president shouldn't go down in history as being part of a particular group of people. But wouldn't if a scandal of such proportions happened, wouldn't that also then tarnish the inner circle of the Republicans and at the same time weaken their stance? And we know how crazy American politics can be. Before you know it, you could have Kamala Harris as president.
Yeah, I mean, well, if he was forced to resign, for example, if he was forced to resign or he decided to resign because it was clearly exposed that he was involved in all the Epstein stuff, then that would be obviously catastrophic because then the renewal of assistance to Ukraine would begin, say a year from now, or I don't know, 6 months from now, or a year and a half from now, instead of 3 years from now, because clearly the Ukrainian army probably can't, highly unlikely it can survive another 3 years unless the configuration of assistance changes really fast. I mean, assistance from Europe and the West, and that's almost impossible, an impossible outcome. So it would be certainly beneficial for those who want to continue the war to see Trump leave early. That would be a godsend for them. So again, it would be, I think, a catastrophic situation where renewal of assistance, there would be no more talk of a peace agreement, continuing casualties for Russia, and then they might, they'll be hoping that somehow the Russian economy begins to falter. I mean, there is some pressure on the Russian economy from this war, but it's nothing close to being, destabilizing politically. But, one can imagine that if the war lasted another 5 years, that the economic burden would begin to become, prohibitive, and then you have the issue of dead bodies coming home over the course of 5 years. Putin has conducted, a very clever, tactical and strategic military plan, which, for political reasons, obviously, maybe for altruistic reasons as well, he doesn't want to see large bodies of young Russian men coming home dead. So they've been using a tactic that keeps the casualties down. Tactics and strategy, they keep the casualties down, and luckily, fortuitously, there was the technological leap in the use of drones, which assists in doing that. So they don't take cities head on. What they do is they surround the cities, they pound the city where the towns where Ukrainian troops are located, They pound them to hell with drones and artillery and rockets, and then maybe leave a corridor open. And when they try to leave, they destroy the troops, or they offer them a possibility of surrender. And it's keeping the Russian casualties considerably lower than they would be otherwise. Uh, if that changes, or if the war lasts so long that the casualties, even in with this tactic and strategies, tend to mount, you could see in 5 or 6 years. Plus, Putin's not a spring chicken. He's going to be what 77 by then, approximately. So, all sorts of things can happen. One cannot exclude a scenario like that. I mean, we're living in very dangerous times. It would be, I think, catastrophic if Trump was forced to resign now and the peace process, any hope for peace, ended. The other thing is, if there was not a peace process, if he gave up on the peace process, and the Russians went to the Dnieper, with Trump in power, there might not be a united NATO response. That would be an overreaction. If Trump is not president, as a Democrat as president, well, then we would be, I think, in danger of having a gross overreaction. No restraint, no American constraints on how the Europeans react. In fact, quite the opposite. The Americans might support some crazy venture, sending troops to Odessa or to Western Ukraine, so the Russians don't cross the Dnieper or whatever. And then you could have your World War III.
And interesting also, on one hand, we have Trump saying he wants peace, yet on the other hand, he's done a big, beautiful deal with Sweden to take some big, not so beautiful missiles to fire at Russia. So you have these contradictions, which Joachim, being one of the Trump supporters, has always alerted me that Donald Trump is all over the shop. Isn't that right, Joachim? He is all over the shop. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm no clearer, but I'm a little more nervy. And for that, I will have to have a scotch tonight just to calm my nerves down, which I'm sure all of you can understand. Dr. Gordon Hahn, Robbie Barwick, and Joachim Hagopian, thank you so much for your time. This has been
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been The World Today and The Protagonist. Thank you very much for your company, and we'll do it again tomorrow, right here. Have a good night.